Hello, my name is Roger Watson and welcome to this session on the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is comprised of the heart and the blood vessels. It is the primary means of transport around the body and it distributes blood to all regions of the body. Blood is the means of transport of oxygen, nutrients, hormones and waste products. The cardiovascular system is controlled primarily by the cardiac centre in the medulla of the brain. Before you begin this session, you may wish to look at this Bozeman Biology YouTube link on the circulatory system. On this slide you can see some of the main features of the cardiovascular system. In the middle, shown in pink there, is the heart, and then there are two systems of major blood vessels leading from it. One system in red, one system in blue. It's traditional to show the arterial system in red. This carries oxygenated blood around the body, and the venous system in blue, which carries deoxygenated blood back to the heart. Looking at it like this, it looks like there are two separate systems. However, and this diagram shows the cardiovascular system is in fact a closed system, completely closed. If you start at any point in the cardiovascular system and follow it all the way around, you will end up back at that point. In this diagram, the two sides of the heart, the left and the right hand side of the heart, are shown separately. The left hand side in red at the right of the diagram and the right hand side of the heart in blue at the left hand side of the diagram. So first of all, let's take a look at the heart. And first of all, we will look at its gross anatomical structure. The heart is classically described as a fist-sized muscular organ located in the thorax. And this diagram shows a human heart removed and held in someone's hand, and you can see that it is exactly as described. It's roughly fist-sized. Now we'll look at some diagrams which will help us to understand the structure and then the function of the heart. This is a diagram of the heart from the outside, removed from the body with the major vessels that are close to the heart cut away. So you can see the heart in the centre of the diagram, and you can see the major blood vessels, the aorta and the vena cava, superior and inferior vena cava, associated with it, and you also see the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary veins there. Running down the outside of the heart are the coronary arteries, and we'll come back to look at their function later, but essentially the coronary arteries supply the heart muscle itself with blood. And this diagram shows the heart from exactly the same angle, but this time cut away to show some of the other features inside the heart and also the flow of blood. Remember that the left-hand side of the heart is on the right-hand side in this diagram, so we can see that the left-hand side of the heart is thicker than the right-hand side. In other words, it's more muscular. This is because the left-hand side of the heart has to pump blood out through the aorta, as is shown here, out to the rest of the body. The blood is then returned to the heart via the venous system, and it comes in from the head and from the lower parts of the body via the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava respectively. And we can see that when the right hand side of the heart contracts, blood is pumped off via the pulmonary arteries to the right and the left lung respectively. Separating the right and left sides of the heart is a piece of heart tissue called the septum. In the previous diagram, you may have noticed that there were some heart valves labelled. Heart valves are there to prevent backflow of the blood into the atria and into the ventricles when the heart contracts. There are two types of valve. There are the atrioventricular valve. One is called bicuspid and one is called tricuspid. For the purposes of understanding how the heart works, it doesn't really matter which is which. The atrioventricular valves lie between, as the name suggests, the atria and the ventricles. And then there is the pulmonary valve, which lies between the heart and the pulmonary arteries. And then the aortic valve, which lies between the heart and the aorta. And here we see the heart with the top sliced away, and we can see the tricuspid and the bicuspid, sometimes called the mitral valve, which lie between the lower part of the heart, the ventricles, and the upper part, which is the atria. And then we can see the aortic and the pulmonary valves, which lie between the heart and the aorta and the pulmonary arteries, respectively. Next, let's look at the circulation of blood through the heart. It's traditional to start at the vena cava, which return blood to the heart from the venous system. These return blood to the right atrium, from where blood flows to the right ventricle, and then out through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. It's then returned to the left-hand side of the heart via the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, and then down to the left ventricle and pumped out through the aorta. And we can see this in this diagram. Blood comes into the vena cava, into the right atria, down into the right ventricle, out to the lungs, back into the left atrium, down into the left ventricle, and out through the aorta to the rest of the body. Note that the atria lie at the top of the heart and the ventricles lie at the bottom. One of the external manifestations of the cardiovascular system are the pulses, and of course these are also used diagnostically. Pulses are located where an artery runs close to the surface of the body over a bony prominence. And there are many places where you can feel pulses. 9 places altogether, starting at the top on the temple, then on the face, and then in the neck and the carotid artery, then in the brachial artery at the bend of the arm, and then the radial artery at the wrist, then below that the femoral artery at the groin, the popliteal artery behind the knees, and then there are 2 pulses in the foot. Many of these can be used diagnostically, but the usual ones that we use are the carotid, the radial, and the femoral. The radial pulse is classically used to measure pulse rate, but if someone's collapsed, the radial pulse tends to be rather weak, so we go for the carotid artery because that's the one that's closest to the heart. We can also use the femoral artery in the groin. The other pulses in the legs, the popliteal and also the pedal pulses, can sometimes be used to diagnose circulatory disorders in the leg. The heart works by electrical activity being generated in it, so now let's take a look at that. Electrical activity in the heart is generated at an area called the pacemaker, and the electrical activity is specifically generated at the sinoatrial node. As the name suggests, it lies between the atria and the sinus, which is where the blood is collected from the vena cava. The electrical activity travels to the atrioventricular node and spreads across the atria. Then travels down the septum, that's the dividing tissue in the heart, along what is known as Purkinje fibres. Then spreads across the ventricles, and the next diagram shows how this looks. And this is very diagrammatic. We can see the sinoatrial node at the top left of the heart there. The electrical activity here, you should note, is generated spontaneously, However, it is under the influence of hormones in the blood and also to nervous stimulation, whereby it's controlled. When the sinoatrial node fires off an electrical stimulus, this travels across the top of the heart, the atria, which are then contract. The activity then moves down the septum and then spreads across the ventricles. So there's a temporal separation here. The atria contract before the ventricles. And the black lines there just show the circulation of blood through the heart. Blood is prevented from moving back up from the ventricles into the atria when the ventricles contract by the valves, and also when the ventricles relax, blood is not pulled back into them because of the valves which prevent that happening at the pulmonary arteries and at the atrium. Next diagram shows this in a little more sophisticated fashion. Here you can see the pulse at the right atrium reaching the AV node, going down the Purkinje fibres in the septum and then spreading across the ventricles. Now, a manifestation of the electrical activity is the electrocardiogram, commonly known as the ECG, and this is a means of picking up the electrical activity on the surface of the body. There's lots of electrical activity in the body due to the electrical activity in the muscles, so the ECG has to be measured at rest. And the ECG involves fixing electrodes to the body and attaching them to a machine which then gives a trace called the ECG tracing. Please note that the ECG machine is not doing anything to the person. It's picking up signals from the body. People commonly misconceive that they're having some kind of electrical treatment or that the machine is going to give them an electric shock, and nothing could be further from the truth. It's merely there to pick up electrical activity in the body. And this is what an ECG trace classically looks like. And there are different components to the ECG, as I'll now explain. The initial pulse is the P wave, followed by the QRS complex, and then the T wave. And these all represent different aspects of the electrical activity in the heart. And the next diagram shows how we can relate them to the mechanical activity in the heart. The P wave picks up the atrial activation, and the QRS complex, which is the largest one, picks up the ventricular activation, and then the T wave indicates the recovery phase during which the ventricles relax. So that's the electrical activity in the heart. The mechanical activity in the heart is called the cardiac cycle, and this takes place in two phases, systole and diastole. Systole is when the heart contracts and pumps blood into the arteries, and diastole is when the ventricles relax and the ventricles thereby fill with blood. And this very crude but effective diagram shows the cardiac cycle. First of all, the atria contract and push blood down into the ventricles. Watch that again. You can see the atrioventricular valves opening up to allow the blood to go down. When the ventricles contract, they close. When the ventricles contract, look at the top at the major blood vessels. When they contract, the valves open, but when the ventricles relax, they close. The phases of the activity are not equal. At the top we have auricular systole. The auricles is just another name for the atria, so we can call that atrial systole. This lasts about 0.1 of a second, and then ventricular systole lasts about 0.3 of a second, and then the cardiac diastole, when the ventricles relax, lasts about 0.4 of a second. So the whole cardiac cycle takes approximately 0.8 or slightly under 1 second. That figures because the normal heart rate, if there is such a thing, is about 70 beats per minute. So half of that cycle is taken up with the relaxation of the ventricles. The heart is essentially a muscle, and it's composed of cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is one of 3 types of muscle in the body. There's skeletal and smooth muscle. We'll look at these in more detail when we come to them later in these sessions, and of course cardiac muscle, which is the focus of the present study, but we will compare and contrast cardiac muscle with skeletal muscle. And this electron micrograph shows what cardiac muscle looks like. Essentially it's composed of short branched cells, but you can see the striped or typical striated structure of muscle within it. Let's just briefly contrast that with skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle looks in some ways similar to cardiac muscle. You can see the striations or stripes within it. However, it's composed of long single strands which are not branched. Again, contrast that with a typical section of cardiac muscle. Now this diagram shows what's going on there. Essentially at the branches which connect different strands of muscle, there are areas called intercalated discs. Each of these cells contains a nucleus, and there are faint stripes or striations within the muscle. The structure of cardiac muscle is related to its function. It has to function rather differently from skeletal muscle, and the branched nature and the intercalated discs allow the electrical stimulus to travel across the muscle rapidly. So the cardiac muscle structure allows rapid conduction of electrical activity across the heart. It acts as what is called a functional syncytium. In other words, it behaves almost as if it were one cell. And this diagram is just meant to show that across the cardiac muscle, electrical activity can travel in many directions. Next, let's have a look at the coronary circulation, and the first thing to note is that the heart has its own blood supply. Despite being bathed in blood constantly and having blood flowing through it, the blood that flows through the heart, or at least through the major chambers, is not the blood supply to the heart. It doesn't take any nutrients from that or put any waste products into it. Instead, it has a separate blood supply called the coronary circulation. Now this figure shows very much in outline the coronary circulation. One thing to note is that the coronary arteries, as they're called, branch off from the aorta just as it leaves the heart. So this carries highly oxygenated blood, which has just freshly been returned to the heart from the lungs and is being pumped out through the rest of the body. So the first organ to receive blood from the heart is the heart itself. There are 2 major branches, the left and the right coronary arteries, supplying the left and the right sides of the heart respectively. And this diagram shows that the coronary arterial circulation subdivides down to supply every aspect of the heart. There is of course likewise a coronary venous circulation to take the blood back into the right hand side of the heart for oxygenation. So we've briefly reviewed the structure and the function of the heart. Now let's look at how it's controlled. The heart is a homeostatic organ, so it takes part in homeostasis and responds to different situations. For example, walking, resting, running upstairs. It wouldn't be involved in homeostasis if it didn't respond to these in different ways. The heart wouldn't serve us well if it just carried on doing the same thing, whether we were walking or running. And the aspect of the heart that is controlled ultimately is the cardiac output, which is the blood that's pumped out by the heart. And this needs to change in different situations. For example, we need more cardiac output when we're running than when we're walking. The cardiac output is composed of two aspects. First of all, the stroke volume, which is the measure of the blood pumped out every beat, and that's approximately 70 mils per beat. And then the heart rate, which is approximately 70 beats per minute at rest. Those two values are quite easy to remember. If we multiply them together, we get 4,900 mils, so a good rule of thumb is that the cardiac output is approximately 5 litres per minute at rest. The cardiac output is mainly controlled by changing the heart rate. And the heart rate is controlled by sympathetic nervous stimulation and also by circulating levels of catecholamines, adrenaline and noradrenaline. But it's hard to separate the control of the heart rate from control of blood pressure. Many factors are involved. So there are many factors involved, and we are going to come back and have a look at the control of blood pressure, but essentially all aspects of the cardiovascular system are controlled in the cardiovascular centre in the medulla of the brain, which influences the cardiac output and also the state of what's called vasoconstriction or vasodilation. These are the extent to which the blood vessels in the body are relaxed or contracted, and it responds, the cardiovascular centre responds to several inputs, pressure receptors and chemoreceptors, and also things like temperature and stretch receptors in muscle, which would indicate that exercise is being undertaken. So let's leave the heart there and look at the rest of the system. It's called the cardiovascular system, cardio for heart, vascular for the vascular system. And the vascular system is composed of vessels through which the heart pumps blood to all regions of the body, and it's comprised of arteries and veins and capillaries. And here we see the arterial and the venous systems, arterial on the left and venous on the right on this occasion. They're very similar because they mirror each other, but as you will recall from a very early slide, these systems are actually closed. They're not two separate systems, and they're joined together in fact by the capillaries. The arteries carry blood away from the heart under pressure from the ventricles. It's slightly inaccurate to say that arteries carry oxygenated blood because the pulmonary arteries in fact carry deoxygenated blood, so the best way to describe arteries is in their function of carrying blood away from the heart. The structure is mainly that of smooth muscle, and here's a typical artery. You can see the ring of red smooth muscle. There's a lumen in the middle, which is a space, and it's surrounded by connective tissue. That's an electron micrograph. But this is a diagram, and we can see that in common with many organs, there's an outer, an inner and a middle layer to the arteries, and we can also see a longitudinal section there. Veins, on the other hand, carry blood to the heart, not under pressure from the heart, but using skeletal and respiratory muscle pumps. which we will come to. Structure, again, mainly composed of smooth muscle. They are similar to arteries, but there is less smooth muscle and they contain valves. And this artery shows a vein on the left marked X and an artery on the right marked Y, and you can immediately see the difference. Arteries tend to be round and with thick muscular walls. Veins tend to have thin walls and tend not to have that characteristic round shape. To put it colloquially, they are more floppy than arteries. And veins contain valves. Veins don't operate under pressure like the arteries do, and blood can move backwards in them if we're static, and pool in various areas of the body, so they have valves located along them, and this helps to keep the blood flowing in one direction. The capillaries join the two systems together, and they are contrasted from the arteries and the veins by containing no smooth muscle and only being composed of epithelial cells, and one layer at that. They transport blood to the tissues, and they enable the diffusion of substances across the capillary wall. And the diameter of a capillary is the same as that of a red blood cell, approximately 7 micrometers, or 7 times 10 to the minus 6 meters in diameter. Here we see the arterial system at the top and the venous system at the bottom, and the capillaries. The red ones contain oxygenated blood which is going to the tissues, and the blue ones contain deoxygenated blood which is coming away from the tissues. There's no differentiation in the structure between those two parts. It just happens to be their functions which are related to the tissues they either serve by taking blood to them or taking blood away from them. We can see that there are small rings of muscle on the arterial side called precapillary sphincters. These play a part in distributing blood around the body. For example, when we're hot or when we're cold, they can open or close to allow blood to come to the surface of the body or retain it in the centre of the body. But we'll come back to looking at that mechanism in a later session. And here's a typical capillary, 1 cell thick and composed of epithelial cells, and in fact it's very porous, allowing material to cross it very easily. And the capillaries are bathed in the interstitial fluid, or the fluid that lies between the cells. So we've seen the basic structures here, the heart and the blood vessels. Let's look at how the circulation around the whole system is achieved. Blood circulation is achieved simply by blood pressure, or at least by the gradient of blood pressure from the heart to the other parts of the body. Put simply, blood pressure is highest in the left-hand side of the heart and lowest on the right-hand side of the heart. Therefore, that's essentially what achieves the circulation and nothing else. So the blood circulation is generated by the heart and maintained by the arteries, which are under some tension. And the outcome of this is a crucial aspect of physiology which enables us to function. And this is called blood pressure. The blood pressure is composed of the cardiac output, which we've already seen, and the peripheral resistance. Peripheral resistance refers to the extent to which the venous system is under tension, either contracted or relaxed, or constricted or dilated, respectively. Therefore, blood pressure equals cardiac output times peripheral resistance. So you can see that the higher the cardiac output and the higher the peripheral resistance, the higher the blood pressure. So cardiac output and peripheral resistance can be used to control blood pressure. So peripheral resistance is provided by the resistance to blood flow in the arterial system. I'm sure you understand that if you try to push fluid down a narrower tube, it's more difficult than if it's being pushed down a wider tube. There's more pressure in a narrower tube. That's essentially the same as blood pressure. And blood pressure can be controlled by changing, as I say, the cardiac output or the peripheral resistance. And peripheral resistance is altered by changing the diameter of the arteries. Through sympathetic stimulation, which decreases the diameter, this will tend to increase blood pressure and increase peripheral resistance, or by parasympathetic stimulation, which increases the diameter, lowers the resistance and tends to lower blood pressure. So note that down diameter, up resistance, up blood pressure, and the opposite is true. So blood pressure and circulation are intimately linked, and as I've said, blood circulation is achieved by the gradient of pressure from the left ventricle to the right atrium, and that can be shown in this next diagram. This diagram takes us from the left ventricle at the left to the right atrium at the right. Those aspects of the circulation which are concerned with oxygenated blood, or the arterial side, are shown in red, and after that the venous side is shown in blue, with a change from red to blue in the capillaries, or in the capillary beds. We can see that there are large fluctuations in pressure at the left-hand side of the diagram. That's caused by the contraction and relaxation of the heart. This becomes attenuated as the blood gets into the arterial system, and these become very dampened towards the further parts of the arterial system. There is no swinging in pressure in the venous system. The blood simply moves there due to the pressure from the arterial side, and also keeps moving in one direction due to the valves that are situated in the veins. So we can see that the blood pressure goes from its highest at about 120 millimeters of mercury down to 0 in the right atrium. There's a concept there shown in the middle called the mean pressure. That's the mean blood pressure. That is defined as the diastolic pressure plus a third of the systolic minus the diastolic. We will come back to mean blood pressure. The systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure are shown there, and so-called normal levels are 120/80, and the difference between those two is the pulse pressure. Without that pulse pressure, without that difference in pressure, there would be no circulation. So I mentioned the concept of normal blood pressure there. This is quite difficult to define because it depends on the person and on conditions and on their age. But blood pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury, and normal blood pressure is around 120 millimeters of systolic and 80 millimeters of mercury at diastolic. So I mentioned the concept of the mean arterial blood pressure, which is defined as the diastolic plus a third of the systolic minus the diastolic. The fact that it's described as only a third of the difference between the two is because diastole lasts longer than the systolic phase. And the mean arterial blood pressure is the blood pressure which maintains flow in the peripheral arteries and in the coronary arteries. So in a sense, the mean arterial blood pressure is a measure of the extent to which the cardiac muscle is being supplied with blood. So it's a very important measure, especially in critical care. The cardiovascular system exists to achieve capillary exchange, in other words, nutrients and oxygen donated to the tissues, carbon dioxide and other waste products taken away. And capillary exchange is enabled by the difference between the capillary blood pressure and the capillary osmotic pressure. Capillary blood pressure is the pressure inside the capillaries pushing materials out, and the osmotic pressure is the extent to which the substances contained in the capillary pull water back in, as shown in this diagram. The blood pressure in the capillaries changes across the capillary bed from approximately 32 millimeters of mercury down to 15 millimeters of mercury from the arterial to the venous sides of the capillary bed. On the other hand, the osmotic pressure doesn't change in the capillaries nor in the interstitial fluid. This means that at the arterial end of the capillary system, the blood pressure exceeds the osmotic pressure and pushes fluid out into the interstitial fluid, and this bathes the tissue cells, and that's exactly what you want because this delivers oxygen and nutrients to the cells. At the venous end, the osmotic pressure exceeds the blood pressure and fluid and substances are brought back in, and again that's exactly what you want. You want carbon dioxide and waste products to be brought back into the capillary system. So that's how the tissue fluid dynamics, as it were, work to achieve the delivery of nutrients where they're needed and the removal of waste products where that's needed. A lot of fluid is pushed out from the capillary system into the interstitial fluid, and it isn't all brought back in. We need an additional system called the lymphatic system, which is parallel to the cardiovascular system, and this works to return excess interstitial fluid to the cardiovascular system. So the lymphatic system serves two purposes. It maintains fluid balance, which is what we're concerned with here. It's also part of the immune system, which we'll come back to later. So this diagram shows the lymphatic system. It's ubiquitous in the body apart from in the head, and it has various features to it which we shouldn't be too concerned with here, but it essentially returns fluid into the cardiovascular system at the subclavian vein. So let's look now at the control of blood pressure. This is achieved by changing cardiac output and peripheral resistance. It's mediated via the medulla, which alters heart rate and peripheral resistance. And this is a homeostatic system. If we look at this here and look at the carotid sinus on the right, which picks up in changes in blood pressure, if it picks up an increase in blood pressure, this inhibits the sympathetic centres and stimulates the vagal centres. The sympathetic centres are located in the cardiovascular control area of the medulla, and the vagal centres in the base of the brain. If they're inhibited, then you get sympathetic activity being turned off and parasympathetic activity being turned on. This serves to slow the heart down and to decrease the constriction of the blood vessels, and therefore it reduces blood pressure. If the opposite happens, if there's a fall in blood pressure, then we get more sympathetic activity and less parasympathetic activity, and blood pressure increases. The kidneys also play a part. They alter blood volume through the work of the hormone aldosterone, and also alter peripheral resistance through the renin-angiotensin system. And we can see very diagrammatically how this works here. Here we see an ischemic or a damaged kidney. It doesn't have to be damaged. If the blood pressure falls, the kidney releases renin. This is an enzyme which acts on plasma angiotensinogen, turned it into angiotensin, which is a potent vasoconstrictor, and this increases blood pressure. That also works on the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, which leads to sodium retention and therefore more water retention in the cardiovascular system, and this also works to increase blood pressure, and the opposite takes place when the blood pressure falls. Finally, the blood. Blood is a tissue composed of plasma and red blood cells. If we put blood into a test tube and let it settle, or if we spin it down in a centrifuge, we see that the majority is composed of plasma, which is composed of serum, which is a fluid, and fibrin, which is a protein. there's a small layer of white blood cells, and then 45% of the volume, which is known as the hematocrit, is composed of red blood cells. So here we see the two aspects of the whole blood, the plasma on the left and the formed elements on the right. The plasma is largely composed of water, of course, but it contains many substances, amino acids, nitrogenous waste, electrolytes, gases and so forth, and it contains proteins, the albumins, which serve to give the blood osmotic pressure, fibrinogen, which plays a part in blood clotting, and the globulins, which play a part in the immune system. On the right hand side, the form elements are composed of the platelets, which play a part in blood clotting, the erythrocytes, which we'll look at here in some detail, which are concerned with oxygen transport, and the leukocytes or white cells, of which there are many types, and we'll come back to looking at these when we look at protection and the immune system. The red blood cell is known as the erythrocyte, and it's a highly specialised cell designed primarily to carry oxygen. It's got no nucleus and no mitochondria, and oxygen is carried mainly bound to a protein called hemoglobin. And this is what erythrocytes look like. They're flat, almost donut shaped, 7 micrometers in diameter. Not everyone's blood is the same, and there are many different ways to classify people's blood, but the major one, which is made use of in emergencies, is the ABO blood grouping. And the ABO blood grouping is due to the existence of antigen-like molecules on the surface of red blood cells. Antigens are substances which cause a kind of immune reaction and are attacked by antibodies. These are called the agglutinogens, and these bind to antibody-type molecules in the plasma called the agglutins. So you can see here that the type of blood is determined by the type of antigen on the blood cell. Type A cells have antigen A, type B have antigen B, type AB cells have A and B antigens, and type O have neither. In the plasma, type A cells contain antibody B, so there's no reaction between the antibody and the antigen, and conversely type B cells contain antibody A. Type AB cells don't contain either antibody in the blood, and type O contain both. So if the wrong combination of the above meet, as can happen in blood transfusion, you get agglutination, clumping of the red blood cells. This is very dangerous and can lead to death. So at the top, if a type A blood donor meets a type B antibody, then there's no agglutination, everything's okay. However, if we mix type A blood with type A antibody from a type B blood donor, you will get agglutination as shown at the bottom. So this is why people with blood type O are known as universal donors, and people with blood type AB are known as universal recipients. People with blood type O can give their blood to anyone. People with AB blood can receive blood from anyone. So the cardiovascular system, just to recap, is comprised of the heart and the blood vessels. It is the primary means of transport around the body, and it distributes blood to all regions of the body. Blood is the means of transport of oxygen, nutrients, hormones and waste products, and it also, you should note, transports heat around the body. The cardiovascular system is controlled primarily by the cardiac centres in the medulla of the brain. So next, and finally, some questions. 1. What is the cardiovascular system comprised of, and what are the 3 types of blood vessel? 2. Describe the heart. 3. In addition to oxygen, name 4 things that the blood transports. 4. What are the 4 chambers of the heart? 5. What are the 4 blood vessels attached to the heart? 6. What are the 4 valves in the heart? 7. Which blood vessels attached to the heart carry oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood, respectively? 8. Describe the flow of blood through the heart. 9. In addition to the radial pulse, name 8 other sites on the body where a pulse can be felt. 10. Describe the generation and spread of electrical activity in the heart. 11. What is a trace of electrical activity in the heart called? What are the 3 sets of patterns observed? 12. What is happening at the 3 wave patterns on the electrocardiogram, and what can happen to the T wave in a myocardial infarction? 13. What are the 2 stages of the cardiac cycle and what is happening at each stage? 14. Describe the cardiac output. What are its components and how is it calculated? 15. What effect do sympathetic stimulation, parasympathetic stimulation and increased end diastolic volume have, respectively, on the cardiac output? What happens to resting heart rate in athletes? 16. What type of muscle is found in arteries and veins? How does this differ between arteries and veins? What do veins have that arteries lack? What is the space in the middle of a blood vessel called? 17. What are the 2 factors that determine blood pressure? What is the equation for blood pressure based on these factors? 18. What 2 factors determine capillary exchange? Which is larger at the arterial end of the capillary bed, and what is the fluid in the tissues called? 19. How are the medulla and the kidneys respectively involved in control of blood pressure? 20. What are the 3 formed elements in the blood? How is one of these formed elements further subdivided into 2 main types? 21. Describe 4 unique things about the specialization of the erythrocyte. 22. What are the 4 main blood types? So this is my email for any questions or comments. The answers to the questions won't all be found in the lecture material. I would expect you to try and find some of this out for yourself, but some more of it can be found in 4 Things About, my blog, which is about a simple approach to anatomy and physiology, and if you specifically look at the entry, the cardiovascular system. Thank you very much for listening.